Welcome back to Insight and the discussion of the laws of war. Torture is outlawed under the Geneva Conventions, but we know that it was used under the guise of enhanced interrogation by the Americans in Iraq and on prisoners taken to the infamous Guantanamo Bay detention center. Despite the controversy, President Trump has now taken office saying he believes torture works. One man of personal experience of exactly that is Mozambique, a British citizen who was first arrested in Pakistan before being taken to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan and on to Guantanamo, where he was held for 3 years before being released without charge. Mozambique, we're discussing the efficacy of torture, if there is any. Do you think it worked on you in that case when you were at the airbase?
It worked on me to produce a false confession. Yes, it did. And the confession that was produced was that I was a member of Al-Qaeda. So in May 2002, in Bagram, I was interrogated by the CIA and the FBI, and they waved pictures of my children that they had seized from my house in Pakistan. There was the sound of a woman screaming in the next room that they led me to believe was my wife being tortured. They said that if you don't cooperate, while my hands were tied behind my back to my legs, being hogtied, that we will send you to Egypt or to Syria. And I know that they had sent people to Egypt.
Did you know what that meant?
Yes, I knew it very well. I'm a Muslim. I am an Arabic speaker. I study history. I understand the history of those regions and what it means to be sent as a Muslim man to these places and sorts of torture. And of
what
course,
we've now come to know as rendition, where practices that wouldn't be acceptable in Western countries can be administered without any kind of concern.
Absolutely. And it was through the CIA that I actually learned about the case of Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi. And I learned later that this man was sent by the CIA from Bagram, eventually to Egypt, where he was tortured into giving a false confession. That false confession became the basis for the justification for the invasion of Iraq. And it turned out to be completely based upon torture. It was a torture confession that took us into war in Iraq. So when people say, does torture work? Yeah, it works in sending us into war that is completely immoral.
Let's spin forward to today, and as we sit here in London, we know that President Trump, the new President of the United States, believes in torture, he says. When questioned about this in the last couple of weeks, he says, I believe in it, but I'm going to succeed, or rather cede, to my Secretary of State. This is General Mattis, who he admits does not believe in torture. What do you think when you hear a president speaking like that?
I remember when the Bush administration used the enhanced interrogation techniques that you referred to in the beginning. It was a cover for torture, but they simply changed the parameters. The Attorney General and his Undersecretary discussed that if something was to constitute torture, it had to be either organ failure or death. Otherwise, it was not torture. But at least Bush didn't say that I believe in torture. Obama came along and he said, we tortured some folk and we will not do it again. We will close Guantanamo and stop the torture program. Now we've got a complete flip with Trump saying that not only will he use torture, he believes that it works. So you've almost got a bipolar relationship with this issue of torture. Torture is a crime. Used in the context of war, it's a war crime. And he specifically said about waterboarding. Now, waterboarding was used during the Spanish Inquisition first. It's called tortura del agua, torture of the water, literally in its original Spanish. It was used by Japanese soldiers against American GIs during World War II, and they were successfully prosecuted for war crimes. It doesn't make sense that this method now can somehow, in the 21st century, in 2017, be reintroduced as something acceptable. It is a crime, and the leader of the free world has just endorsed war crimes, and that is very, very serious, especially for us as a country that cooperates with intelligence and defense on it.
What politicians say publicly, of course, and what actually goes on under the radar can be two completely different things. I mean, your life proves that, doesn't it?
Yes, and I believe that even rendition and torture was going on during the Obama administration. But you're right, what politicians say and do are
with plausible deniability built into the system.
Of course, and that's quite possible, even if Trump now says that he'll follow what his defense secretary says and that he won't torture. The cat's out of the bag. He's already expressed his intention, what he believes as the president. So bearing in mind what America has done over the past years with the war on terror, why wouldn't you torture? Everybody else has. In fact, the difference with Obama was that Bush used extrajudicial detention in Guantanamo, Obama used extrajudicial killing by using the drone strikes and killing people without any legal process and no fallout, nobody calling you a human rights abuser when you do it.
Let me put to you the race to the bottom argument here, which is that does the end justify the means, which is relevant here, I think. If you are up against ruthless people who burn prisoners alive, as Al-Qaeda have done, or the fight now against Daesh, where appalling injustices were committed against what we know for the face of it seems to be innocent people, then is it not an approach to say we'll fight like with like? If they're going to terrorize and kill, then we will use every tool to try and fight back.
Well, the problem with this is, first of all, the rule of law, is that the prohibition on torture is absolute. There are no circumstances where...
But that applies to everybody, doesn't it?
It does, but particularly to those who've signed up to it. Now, the problem is Al-Qaeda...
But does it apply to America any more than Al-Qaeda?
Well, Al-Qaeda's not signed up to any of this stuff. Al-Qaeda is
so it's okay for Al-Qaeda to do anything?
It's not okay for Al-Qaeda to do it. But the thing is that when you try to purport yourself to be a bastion of human rights, democracy and freedom, Al-Qaeda never calls for democracy. Al-Qaeda is against democracy. Al-Qaeda doesn't call for freedom either. America does. And it holds itself up to certain standards. So it must either say that we do, or do what the Iraqi regime, for example, that it does in its fight against Al-Qaeda or ISIS. It tortures also. It skins people alive also. It burns people alive. They do all of that. The Shiite militias in Iraq have been doing all of those things. So if we want to open that door, we might as well say we follow the same rule as the Iraqis. Because after all, let's face it, ISIS has caused far more damage to the Muslim world than it has to the Western world. And so if you want to take anybody's rule on this, why don't you follow the Iraqi government?
Why do you say ISIS has done more damage to the Muslim world than anybody else?
Because ISIS is physically present in the Muslim world, and every day they're in battle with either the Free Syrian Army, with the Muslim groups, with the Shiite groups, with the Kurdish groups. They're not on the battling on the streets of Britain or America.
So you would argue, and I know you now speak, you write about all this, that somebody has to be brave enough to take the moral high ground here. And even under extreme provocation, and under the pressure which any president or prime minister or leader of any country has to be, which is its fundamental job to keep their fellow countrymen and women safe, they must resist the temptation to do anything to another human being if they are led to believe it will help keep them safe.
Well, look, I gave the example of Ibn Sheikh al-Libya, but I'll give it again so it's understood. And that is, we took this man, the Americans took this man, they tortured him into giving a false confession. That false confession was justified to the United Nations Security Council in 2003 by Colin Powell.
I understand that.
As a result of that, Al-Qaeda came into Iraq and then changed incrementally into Islamic State in Iraq, in the dungeons of Abu Ghraib and Camp Bukka, where they formulated their ideology with ex-Baathists and so forth. And what you got was something far worse than Al-Qaeda in the end. So that's what torture produced.
I understand that example and understand you're genuine in saying that. What we don't know, and I have no way of knowing, is what hideous attacks or damage to my way of life or to American way of life may have been prevented by information that prisoners like yourself may have given the authorities.
Well, you're saying may have, and I don't know, and nobody else has said no.
Neither of us can prove that one way or the other, can we?
No, we can't, and so there's no way to answer this question. The only ones who can answer this question if people come forward and say, well, here's a plot that we uncovered by torturing this person nearly to death or whatever it is, and that's how we did it. I've not heard of any such case.
Mozambique, thank you very much. And that's all for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.